I see Bob Finkelstein. Come on up.
Right, I spent a lot of time at my grandma's kitchen table and listening to her stories, but there was one story that always stuck out in my mind, and that was a story about how her and my grandfather, after World War II, found how they had restored a Jewish cemetery in their hometown in Poland. And as the story went, during World War II, the Nazis had killed all the Jews in the town, and they had also gone into the cemetery and ripped out the headstones and used them to pave the streets. And she used to tell a story that they had, after World War II, they found out about it, and they donated some money and to restore the cemetery, but there was no record of where any of these headstones went. So what they did was they built a wall around the cemetery, and they used the headstones to make a mosaic. And I heard the story, and I always imagined this like nice, sidewalk with this wall mosaic for this cemetery. And I never thought that I'd have the chance to see it. But about 10 years ago, I was in Europe, and I had a couple weeks to travel, and I thought it would be kind of like a cool side trip to go see the town where my grandparents were from, because I'd heard so many stories about it, and I also thought it would be a really cool thing to see this cemetery. So I had no idea how I was going to get there. I knew the name of the town, looked it up on a map. I got a dictionary and figured I could rent a car and just go out there and start asking people where it was. It was a small town of like about 10,000 people. So I got a ticket and went to Warsaw. And a couple days after arriving, I drove out to this town called Mizrich, which was about a half an hour outside of Russia, on the eastern border of Poland. And so I got out there, and I got my guidebook, and there's two roads that lead into the center of town. I have no idea which one to go down, but I figure I'm just going to drive and find the first person and ask them, where's this Jewish cemetery? So I start driving down this first road. I see this old gentleman just kind of walking down the street with the cane, and I stop the car, get out, and I take my dictionary, and I'm like, Jewish cemetery. And the guy knows exactly what I'm saying. He starts pointing to the other road, the other road into town. And he's like, down there, and I don't know how I understood it, but he's like, it's not very far. Just drive down that road and you'll find it. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be easier than I thought. So I get back in the car, start driving down this road, and sure enough, in about a mile and a half, I see the cemetery. Only I'm like, this can't be the cemetery because there's no mosaic of headstones. And I pull up to the cemetery, and I see the headstones inside, and they've got crosses on them. So I'm like, this guy didn't understand me, apparently. But I noticed across the street there's a house with a like brown stucco wall around it, but it's around the property, but it's not very big. And I'm like, that can't, that maybe it's a cemetery, but I'm like, it can't be because there's no mosaic. And I get in the car and I just continue to drive. And before too long, it's clear that there's not going to be a cemetery because the houses are getting more and more dense. And eventually I come to the center of town about a mile or two down the road. And like I said, my grandma had told me a lot of stories, so I wanted to see like a little bit of the local color. So I get out, do some exploring, imagining, stories my grandma had told me. And after about an hour, I get back in the car, and I'm like, okay, now I'm going to find the cemetery. So I'm in the square, and I'm looking around like, who's going to be able to tell me where the cemetery is? And I see this older gentleman, he's probably in his 50s, shaved head, wearing like overalls, he's like a worker. And I go up to him, and I'm like, take out my phrase book, and I'm like, Jewish cemetery. And the guy starts pointing back down the road from which I'd come, where the other guy had said that it was. So I'm like, okay, maybe I just didn't see it this time. So I get back in my car, I thank him, get back in the car, and I start driving back down the road. And this time I'm like looking down every side street, trying to find this, like, Jewish cemetery that I'm looking for. And I don't see anything. And before too long, I'm back at the Christian cemetery, and the house with the wall around it, and I go past that, and before too long I'm back at the road going back to Warsaw. So I'm like, this can't be it. I'm like, this was a pretty stupid idea. You have no idea how to speak Polish, and like whatever. So I turn back around and I head back to where I'm from, where I thought it was going to be, which was close to the Christian cemetery. And there's a bunch of houses around, so I'm like, okay, I'm just going to find a house and ask. Maybe somebody knows. So I park the car, get out of the car, and I hear this buzzsaw, or table saw, and I walk in the direction of the table saw, and it takes me to a courtyard in the back of the house. And I go into the back of the house and into the courtyard, and as soon as I do, the table saw stops, and out from this room walks this gentleman, and it's the same guy from like the town square in his overalls. And of course he sees me, and he knows exactly what I'm doing there. He doesn't even say a word. He just grabs me by the arm, pulls me out of the courtyard, and he's like, he points to the house with the brown stucco wall around it. He said, Jewish cemetery. And I'm sitting there, and I don't know what to say, but I'm like, that's not it, because there's a mosaic. There must be another one. But I thank him, and I'm like, okay, I'll just go and see what I can find. So I go to the house, knock on the door, and nobody's there. And I'm like, well, I still got to figure this out. So I see that there's like a little foothold that I can climb up, so I climb up the wall a little bit, and I see some like headstones, like there's grass, there's like an open grass field, and I see some headstones, so I'm like, okay, this is a cemetery. I'll just explore, maybe I can tell something. So I found a place where I can climb over the wall, and I climb up, and then I jump down. When I jump down, I'm like, I jump down, and then I'm facing the wall, and I stand up, and then I see that, I've been mistaken to think that in a country where like an entire culture had been wiped out, that they would want to, advertise that this was a Jewish cemetery, because there right in front of me was a mosaic of headstones that my grandma had always told me would be there.